Welcome to Managing Love Intelligently. I'm Jason.
And I'm Stephen Ng, marriage and family therapist.
That's right. And I am the question master. I ask Steve all the questions, at least all the questions I could think of in the moment. So how this works is I present a topic to Steve, which I planned ahead of time, but Steve has no idea about, and we talk about it for an hour or so. Today's topic is what's so bad about repression?
Wow.
So
a question I've been asked only once in my life. Yeah.
By a priest.
Yeah.
We'll get to that.
Okay.
Okay. So before we kick off the conversation, if you have a question for Steve, visit stephening.com and fill out the contact form. At the end of each episode, Steve will answer a listener question, so stay tuned for that. And if you enjoy the podcast, please subscribe, share it with your friends and family, and consider leaving a review. So in episode 2 of the podcast, titled Religion and Sexuality, you mentioned a story about a priest asking you about repression. I thought we could start there and then kind of go into it.
Sure. That's a little dark. It's going to be a little dark, ladies and gentlemen.
The idea with the priest?
Yeah, I can go ahead and just tell the story if you want.
Yeah.
So, okay. So I'm talking to this priest. He understands what I do for a living. He's been totally supportive and respectful. This is back in the days when I was going to church regularly. And he said, well, what's so bad about repression anyway? And I said to him, well, before I get to what I said, I think it came out of his idea that if we didn't repress ourselves, life and civilization would kind of become chaotic, and that people would be really just out of control, because repression is that very civilized impulse to restrain from saying things or doing things that would be socially inappropriate, for example.
And this is in many religions. Repression is a theme that, this guy was Christian, I believe.
Of course, yeah. And I'm not a Satanist, for crying out loud.
But the fear and talk, it's like people say religion gives them the morals and the guide in order to keep that chaos in check. Otherwise, like, that's a big argument I've heard a lot of religious people make.
I've heard that argument a bit myself, and it's patently untrue. I would consider myself or self-describe as a humanist. And human beings have had values since the beginning of time. And it is out of our values that we develop moral codes. And those moral codes are simply little internalized rules that if I believe truth is important, then I have a rule that says don't lie or always try to tell the truth. And for those who value anything like, say, human sexuality, of course, there's going to be the equivalent of some rule that says don't lie in order to structure our sexual conduct. But it is, I think, fair to say human beings were managing their love lives intelligently even before religion came along. So it's not true that we need religion in order to have values or morals, or to be able to think about ethical dilemmas where our morals seem to be in conflict with one another.
Yeah, I would say too, just from an outsider's view, it seems like those people who are religious, they're having the most wars and having the most issues defending those religions. So it's like counterintuitive to what they're saying.
Well, I don't identify as an atheist because I don't think the idea of God is worth even taking a position on anymore. It's like talking about the tooth fairy. But for me, I have to stick up for the non-religious villains of world history too, because I don't think Hitler and Stalin or even Genghis Khan were particularly religious. Mm-hmm. So they managed to kill many millions of people. That's true. And, it's just human nature being what it is. We struggle with our violent impulses. Mm-hmm. And, if only we could repress some of those impulses a little bit better. So the priest, who is a wonderful man, asked me the question, so what's so bad about repression? And my response really came right out of the thinking that we talk about here on Managing Love Intelligently. And it's really about lifestyle in that versus a tool out of your toolbox. So I said to him something like, well, it's a great tool to use. If I meet a very attractive woman, a woman with an amazing skin that's just so lovely, and I'm possessed of an impulse to reach out and caress her cheek because it is so lovely, I can repress that. And I can do that with hardly any harm whatsoever. I won't have nightmares that night. I won't feel like I'm a lesser man. And I don't think there is anything bad that comes out of that. But if I live with sexual repression, and that reaching out to touch a beautiful woman's skin, that is sexual, by the way. So, because I don't ever have that impulse with with men. But as a lifestyle, living with repressing my sexuality and my normal thoughts, my normal feelings, and my normal behaviors, that's going to create endless problems. It would be like repressing my desire to eat rather than repressing my desire to have bad manners. The desire to eat is a perfectly normal thing, and I want to find an intelligent and socially acceptable way to express that. When it comes to sexuality, it's really the same. I just need to find an intelligent and socially acceptable way for me to be me. And he heard what I had to say, and he thought about it for maybe 2 whole seconds, and he had to agree. So it was not a big conflict or anything like that, but it was just, I think we're all so used to repression, and we think nothing of repressing other people. Right now, I don't like to get into politics in these podcasts, but right now in our country, the GOP is looking at turning back some things like women's right to choose, or even I was reading the other day, heterosexual marriages being able to seek a divorce, that they wanted to make it harder for people to get divorced. And I think for me, it's not like I want to encourage people to go out and get a divorce willy-nilly because they had some little tiff, in the afternoon. But at the same time, I really don't think we want to make repression of escaping dysfunctional relationships the norm. I think it's a healthy thing for people to want to get out of a deeply flawed marriage that grew out of a mistake they made.
And then going back to that priest, he isn't the repression part of the religion? Like, don't they talk about repressing sexuality and things like that?
Well, yeah, sure. So when we talk about normal human sexuality, if humans, 99% of humans all engage in a certain behavior, then it's the very definition of normal, right? So 99% of people masturbate when they're in their teen years.
And while God's watching.
Wow, you really know how to kill the mood. Yeah. Those poor teenagers listening to this. Oh my gosh.
Or maybe they can learn to embrace it. Like maybe they...
Well, if you look up masturbation and religion in Wikipedia, there's apparently not a religion on the planet that thinks it's normal or healthy or good. But, and so there's an example of religion really keying into the whole notion of repression. And frankly, I think repression and religion do go together, because in terms of guarding market share, for religion to be able to control humans and their sexuality really makes it possible to enhance the brand quite a lot. For example, if masturbation is a normal thing and teenagers routinely, post-puberty, they routinely are tempted to masturbate. I don't know if tempted is the right word, desire to masturbate. But then they're going to a church that teaches this is a sin. And most religions do, if not all. Then they masturbate, they're consumed with guilt. Then they have to go to confession or go back to religion in their prayer life and ask God for forgiveness and wrestle with their guilt and then repent and try to do better. And then when they don't do better, then they have to go back. So it's like, it's a little bit like if at the grocery store, they routinely passed out highly addictive drugs. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, that's cigarettes. And so it keeps you coming back, right?
Yeah.
You have to keep coming back to the store. And I think with church or religion in general, I don't want to blame Christianity because I think it's pervasive across all institutionalized religion. Just having a captive population that gets guilty over normative behaviors makes it really easy to keep repeat customers coming back again and again.
Yeah. And what does that do for people, though, to be dealing with that guilt over and over? Like, doesn't that mess with you as an adult? Like, doesn't it cause issues?
Well, people seem to fall into two camps, or maybe it's three, I guess. One is the people who are, kind of get over it and they just stop taking religion seriously and they continue to maybe attend or not, but those
people, it's like, why are you attending? Why don't you just leave it?
So many reasons, Jason, so many reasons. One, to please your in-laws. I mean, didn't you have decent in-laws? Of course you want to please them. Or perhaps to please your spouse. Or perhaps because, well, you don't agree with that part of it, but you want your kids to grow up in the religion.
To me, it's like, that's always been like a line since I was like 7, since I was a teenager. I was like, I just can't get on board with that. If you're going to even have that little bit of hypocrisy, I'm out.
So, oh, wow. So you're straight up radical on this.
Yeah.
See, for me,
I've had that since I was a teenager, and it's caused me some issues.
Yes, it has. I've made my peace with being somewhat hypocritical because I think accusing anyone of hypocrisy is like accusing them of being human. We all have moments in our lives where our morals and our behavior don't match up. So the idea that I'm living...
Not me. No, I'm joking.
The idea that I might be living a bit of a lie here and there, yeah, I can,
So that's just okay. All humans are just...
Well, I think it's okay to the degree that one can accept it. If it's extremely uncomfortable, as it is for you, I think, yeah, you have to bail. But for me, it also is just an example. The whole masturbation example is an example where I remember from the 60s that people were like really frowned upon to have openly sexual relationships prior to marriage. And that, of course, was a religious thing, right? Prior to getting your paperwork processed in holy matrimony, you were not supposed to be playing any games like hide the weenie. So for people who are religious, that was a taboo. Only nowadays it's considered more normative. I mean, really not so unusual at all. And it's kind of rare to meet the religious people who are still virginal all the way up into their late 20s, if they haven't found the right spouse. So I think it is changing, and partly it's changing because we're all talking, we're all communicating, and we're talking about topics that in decades gone by were forbidden, and figuring out, and I have to give a nod of thanks to all the sex researchers out there, starting with Dr. Kinsey, because their great sin and why they were so controversial, all of them, is because in their research, they would come back and publish what we actually told them we did. It's just we didn't know that anybody else was doing those things. And then when you figure out, oh, this many people are doing this, I guess it's normal then. I guess it's not so weird. And it's the same with masturbation, premarital sex, and all the other forbidden things. Like my dearly beloved and now deceased former grandmother-in-law, she she didn't even know what oral sex was. And she
her whole life.
Yeah, and then she learned about what it was from one of her adult daughters. And her response to that was, any man who would want his wife to do that must be crazy. He needs to be in a mental institution.
Yeah.
And thank God they didn't even talk about oral sex performed on women. So who knows what she would have thought about that. But to be so ignorant and uninformed, and to think all of these very normative human sexual behaviors are sins, is a pervasive and systemic form of repression that I think does a great disservice not only to humans who are trying to be normal, but also to religion itself. Because I don't think these sexual prohibitions are the be all and end all. I don't think they're the core of what religions are trying to share when they're at their best. Yeah. But they become huge litmus tests of whether or not you're a good believer or not a good believer. And the list goes on and on. Of course, you're not supposed to have an abortion. Of course, you're not supposed to be having sex out of wedlock. Of course, you're not supposed to be having too much sex, and too much is whatever anybody else thinks is too much, because that means you're carnally minded. And there's no end to it. There's no end. For the controlling person, there is no end of subject matter that doesn't ask for control. So that's what it ends up being. And that's why I say, repression is a great tool in the toolbox, but so is free expression of who you are. And so is actually being proud of who you are. These are all helpful tools, each with their own timing issues, because there's a time and a place for all of it. But repression itself as a lifestyle is a curse.
Yeah. So, and you think religion and sexuality should merge?
Well,
I don't know if that's, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you have.
Yeah, I don't think there's a merger issue as much. The language I would use would be more that all believers, and even those of us who are non-believers in anything like that, we need to integrate our sexuality and our spirituality. Now, when I say spirituality, I'm not talking about the supernatural necessarily. I think spirituality is a much larger topic than religion. So if for those of us who remember high school math class and Venn diagrams, a large Venn diagram marked S for spirituality would easily contain the small subset marked R for religion. And when we think about spirituality, it's really a reference to the unseen portions of life that involve meaning and context, and answer questions like, why are we here? Why am I here? What am I to do with my life? What is right and what is wrong? And specifically, what is right and what is wrong for me? So spirituality is a part of the human birthright, just like music. You don't have to be a musician to appreciate music and love music and want to have music in your life. And you don't have to go to church to be a profoundly spiritual person. So the practices that profoundly spiritual people get into that are not necessarily religious could include meditation. It could include conversation with others who are like-minded or different, just trying to really understand your own journey, your own path, and what is really working for you and for the people around you. I think all of that is part of spirituality. And I really wish people could understand that they really need to be integrated, because what's really great about spirituality is it has to do with all of that context and the meaning of life, and it provides us with direction. But sometimes spirituality gets way too big for its britches and starts demanding certain things of believers. And what's great about sexuality is it really grounds all of us to life on this planet. I mean, it firmly plants our feet in the reality of our biology. We are animals. Specifically, we are mammals. I had a believer in my office the other day who refused to believe that we were animals. And then it was
a touchy subject for people.
Yeah. But there was another equally conservative guy in his group who said, well, humans are mammals. And he could point out, and mammals are animals. Yeah, that's true. We're not disembodied angels floating around in the sky. We are animals, and we have this animal nature that I think is a beautiful part of who we are, and kind of an exciting dimension to our human experience, right along with our spirituality. But they're both present, and they're both present all the time. So if I'm engaged in sexual conduct that doesn't conform to my values and my own personal morals, then I'm going to be feeling a very natural, highly evolved response called guilt. And I know we've all seen those bumper stickers that say something pejorative about guilt. I don't know if it's screw guilt or whatever it is, but it's something like that. But guilt is what normal people feel when they know they've done something wrong. And it's what people dealing with psychopathology feel when they do anything somebody else told them was wrong. So really having some clarity in your spirituality about what's right and what's wrong, I think is super important. And I think sexuality is such a wonderful telegram to the human mind that says, this works for me, this does not work for me. This feels right, this doesn't feel right. This is comfortable, this is not comfortable. And when we kind of go with nature, I think we're far more likely to develop a spirituality that really makes sense and that's truly human. And so, myself as a humanist, I would say, yeah, it's a requirement. You have to have your sexuality speaking to your. There has to be a conversation back and forth where my sexuality informs my spirituality, and then my spirituality is doing exactly the same thing with my sexuality. And in that conversation, we have a lot of joy, we have a lot of peace, and we're able to manage love intelligently.
It sounds like you're starting a religion on this podcast right now.
I often think about that because people obviously started religions all over the planet. And I think it really is time for humanity to evolve some sort of a form of spirituality that could be shared communally, but that really embraces human sexuality for what it is. And I don't mean in the same way an orgy embraces human sexuality without.
That's the communion. That's like all right, everyone get naked. Time to.
Oh my God, that'd be my nightmare, right? I could just imagine it. But I think being able to love one another, be tolerant of one another, to be tolerant of sexual differences. There's no right and wrong when it comes to individual human sexual needs. Like those of us who are heterosexual really need to get off our high horse looking down our nose at people who are homosexual. And the same with looking at people who are bisexual or polyamorous or any of these other behaviors, because we're all trying to do the best that we can to figure these things out and to live our lives in a way that works for us. And then as time goes by, it's not just us, it's also our mate and our children and all the other people in our community.
Yeah.
So I think hatred has no place in any of this. As a response, I think the value there would be honoring people, respecting people, and even loving people for who they are.
Yeah, that's great. Good things to live by. And what would you say about like a Buddhist or like what monastics are? So like they give up sex, for instance. Do you feel like?
Well, sort of. I mean, everybody who says they give up sex, there are a lot of exceptions.
Hypocrisies.
Yeah, there's a lot of exceptions to that. So
So say though, let's just say somebody does, they're like, I'm going to devote myself to this path, and they intentionally choose to repress, or it sounds like they don't, they work through it through breathing and things like that.
Well, they deny themselves sex. That's no longer a viable option.
Okay.
Let's say they do that.
So what about people like that who consciously choose to do it? Like, is that like, how do you see that, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think if they're actually doing that and it's working for them, I'm all for it. Mm-hmm. It's just that I haven't really seen that. So it's challenging, because for every person who claims to be doing that, there are a lot, or let me put it this way, for every person who claims to be doing that and for whom this is thriving for them, perhaps they were born asexual.
Yeah.
There's another 100 people who are trying to do it, who are claiming it, and who are really tormented or miserable. I mean, I have so many clients in my office every year who've had sexual abuse at the hands of clergy. And that includes nuns. So, nuns as perpetrators. So I've had, there's just so much hypocrisy and so much of a breakdown in the failure to manage sexuality that could go so much better, right? If we could just honestly accept, yes, I'm a sexual being. I've always been a sexual being, and I always will be a sexual being. How can I manage this in an honorable, loving way?
Yeah. But there are people out there that can do it and repress it or deny that thing and live without committing any crimes against other people, sexual crimes. But I think that number would be really rare.
Super rare. And I think that the asexual among us need to be honored and embraced as well, and not treated as if they're mentally ill or there's some kind of problem with them for being that way. But I have had a number of clients who are asexual who, this is going to sound funny, but they didn't mind being sexually active because sexuality was just so meaningless and so insignificant to them. So they would get together because they still had the capacity to form intimate relationships, to really care about people, and they had the desire to be loved and treasured as well. And so for them, as they described it, it was having sex with someone was a little bit like doing a favor for your spouse that normally you wouldn't want to do, like perhaps take out the garbage. And you do that because you were asked to do it, and you want to support your family, and provide for a more pleasant environment. But that wouldn't work for most of us, would it? Having an asexual partner who is willing to have sex, because most of us have a desire to be desired. And if my partner, upon discovering that I was interested in having sex, looked at me and said, well, I can help you with that if you want. I mean, that doesn't quite get me to where I want to go. Yeah. So, and God bless, the asexual, I think, and I use this word God bless a lot in this podcast, and I don't believe in God. So it's just an expression I keep using, but thank heaven. Can I say that? Thank heaven for the asexual, because I do think in our diversity, there lies tremendous strength. We have this capacity to look at so many problems from so many different perspectives. And I think having gay people in our lives, bisexual people in our lives, and straight people in our lives, it's all good if we can all treat each other with dignity and respect.
But what about a person who is sexual? And then it's like, I'm going to
Jason. I'm
going to go on this path. And this isn't me. I've made my mind up about this. I thought about it. I have thought about it. But what if they're just like, I am sexual, but I'm going to go and live a path where I dissolve all of my desires, all of my human things, and I'm going to then enter into this state of
sexual
spirituality.
Well, sexual denial is what it is. I mean, whether it's spiritual or not remains to be seen, but it starts off with denial.
Well, wait till you hear what's coming out of my mouth once I don't have sex for 10 years.
Well, yeah, exactly. And also where your eyes go when you're talking to people. I think there's always been a path towards spirituality through denial of the flesh.
Okay.
And so the early church fathers were famous for denying themselves social company, and they would live in caves and as hermits.
Yeah.
And for a lot of this same mindset, the remedy was to deny themselves sleep. And so they would pray all night and then stay up all the next day trying to really purge the flesh in favor of spiritual growth. The same is true of those of us who were encouraged to fast and who bought into fasting.
Yeah.
So there are all these different disciplines that come up. We don't hear too much anymore in church about denying one another sex or denying oneself sex, but it was a thing, and it's always been there. It's just not very popular right now. And I think rightfully so, because I think all of, it's better than denying yourself food. It's just better to figure out how to have a healthy relationship with food. Forget about how we all each individually feel about ourselves, because we get terribly confused when we're talking about our own lives. But let's imagine, if you will, and I'm including the audience in this, imagine that you have some young person in your life, like a son or a daughter, and how would you want them to relate to food? To see it as an evil that takes them from the spirit and that they need to be purging the flesh? No, probably not. You would want them to have some sort of a more sustainable pattern in relating to food that would be healthy and conducive to their long-term health. And it's the same, I think, with sleep. The idea that I'm going to deny myself sleep so I can pray all night, and again, get extra close to God through doing that. I don't think that's a particularly healthy approach, and it certainly bodes ill for those of us who might be driving for a living. I don't think bus drivers get to do that.
Yeah.
So the same, I think, is true of sexuality. It's just a natural human part of who we are, and learning to have a healthy relationship with our sexuality, I think, is really important. And I don't think that necessitates any one answer like, oh, we all have to be masturbating X number of times per week. I think it means each individual has an obligation to figure that out for themselves, what would be healthy. And figuring it out for yourself, though, shouldn't preclude having safe people with whom one can discuss these things and even get their own stories and their own experiences, because it might inform us how we too should live.
Yeah.
So myself, an example of this for me would be, I like sex and I like women. And so as a young man, the idea of going out when I was single and getting the attention of beautiful women was a very attractive idea to me. And in that part of my life, I would say I was grossly immature. Not that I don't enjoy that same experience even now, but it just meant so much to me, and it really made opaque all my other needs in regard to relationships. So instead of,
because you were focusing on that one need of that wanting you,
and my own vanity in terms of, oh, she's paying attention to me, and oh, how great that feels, and this is so wonderful. And then maybe we end up going back to somebody's place later for sex or not, but the whole thing was really more cartoonish in its two-dimensionality. And that third dimension that gives it everything depth is, in my opinion, really looking for intimacy where we can safely share our lives with each other. And that's not done necessarily through sex. It also includes conversation and spending time together, having fun and going out. It also includes, I think, sharing who I am spiritually with this other person. So, most of us have had that experience where we've had meaningless sex at one time or another. And if you haven't had any, meaningless sex is pretty great. But once you have had enough meaningless sex, you get to a point where it's no longer satiating. It's rather disappointing. In fact, it's just downright uninteresting.
Yeah.
So
just like becomes like completely normalized. And
right. It's a little bit like anything in our life.
Or something.
We learn how to read and we want to read, and it's exciting. Ooh, I read the primer in grade school, Dick and Jane. And so, this is a very wonderful feeling of satisfaction, but I don't want to be reading Dick and Jane for the rest of my life. I'm not going to feel satisfied. And so my taste in literature develops. I want deeper, more meaningful experiences. The same thing is true with all aesthetic experiences. And I think it's true with food and even sleep. We want to have the best. We want more. We want something more, I don't know, something not just more meaningful, but something that rings truer or resonates more fully with our humanity.
Well, you want that intimacy, I think.
Well, intimacy for sure, right? I want that. But even if I'm talking to someone, and we've joked about this before, the date who's got this really objectionable tattoo that you never noticed before. And all of a sudden you realize, oh, we're never going to be a couple. But there's still this joy and pleasure that's available to those who can just slow down enough to enjoy getting to know another human being.
Yeah.
Even if we're not going to take each other home for the night, it's pretty cool getting to know where somebody's coming from, how they became who they are, and how that works for them, and what they like or don't like about what they're doing with their lives. That's pretty amazing. And there's always going to be sex down the road for most of us. And I know that there are people listening to this who've never had sex. And for them, I mean, that's a different podcast, right? We'll be talking about that someday. But I think for all of us, sexuality is so much better experienced as a part of our lives we manage rather than a part of our lives we repress. And for those who are really interested in drawing closer to a deep spiritual experience, I would just say, there might be a time in your life where you simply abstain for the sake of abstinence, just to see what that ride feels like.
Yeah, I want to just go into there. So speaking of that ride, I've been on that ride for 41 days.
No wonder you're so irritable.
So, yeah.
Oh my God.
but I did it, and it's been an interesting journey. And I think of myself, I'm like, okay, that was, because it comes up and comes up. You can't ever get rid of this sexuality that is flowing through you. It's like it's gone for a bit, comes up, and you're like crazy. And usually if you go to that point, then you go and do it, masturbate, and then you're relieved, and then you go on your day.
Right.
So I learned a lot through that, and it's almost over. And it's like tomorrow's my last day of it.
So there'll be a small explosion going off in your building.
Yeah.
Over there. So yeah.
But really quick, 42 days did that. And I think that's something interesting for any adult to do, male, because it really kind of gets you more in tune with what's going on inside, and allows you to like breathe with it and be with it, rather than just completely just releasing it. Because that then becomes like a compulsive thing where it starts like a self-soothing thing that you could have been possibly doing as a kid. So I wanted to just like rewire everything. That's why I did it.
Yeah. And I think that's legit. It's like the person who goes on a day-long or 3-day-long fast, and they're just trying to reboot some aspect of their life experience. And also the person who takes a break from relationships after a marital failure or a breakup of some kind. They take a break and just learn to be comfortable within themselves, with their own company.
Well, that I think those are so huge to do that. And I don't think most people do, because it's that discomfort, like the discomfort you feel when you can't go masturbate or whatever is very discomforting. That's why I find it insane that religious people, I would like to get them in a room and be like, you really think 14, 15-year-old boys are going to repress this insane thing that's almost impossible for an adult male to do? And their thing is that, and their sexuality is like skyrocketed. And I was like, what do you like?
Well,
wake
then they
up.
would look at you pityingly and say, oh, Jason, Don't you know that with the Lord, all things are possible?
I could.
So I had a wonderful client.
I'd be like, do you know Steve Ng? I was like, look at his record of people he's dealing with. I was like, you guys are failing. I was like, look at the world of religion. You're failing. Admit it.
Yeah, you would think that, I mean, because religion is an elective procedure, you don't have to be religious, but you can choose to be religious. And part of the implied warranty of all religions is that it's going to make your life better. You believe as we believe, you attend our services, and you support the central headquarters with your donations, and we are going to help you have a better life. But in my office, where I work with people routinely who are arrested for criminal charges, most of them have attended church quite often, and church appears to offer no protective effect whatsoever for these individuals because it's simply repression. It's not teaching people how to manage their love lives intelligently.
Yeah.
So, I think it's inherently flawed, and with inductive reasoning, you ask yourself, well, do you think it's going to be better to manage any of your physical needs with some openness and relaxation of the rules so you're free to adapt to changing circumstances and to try different things? Well, yeah, of course, other than compared to total repression. Yeah, of course, it's going to, you're going to have greater odds of success.
Yeah.
I think I have an anecdote here, and what I learned from one of my clients who was part of the Latter-day Saints. He was married, and his wife was also a Latter-day Saint, and they had a really great relationship. And he was just a very open and honest man. And he had 3 sons, and his first 2 sons decided they wanted to go on a mission. And actually, all 3 of them wanted to go. The first 2, but part of the requirement to be eligible for the mission field in the LDS Church is that you must abstain from masturbation for a year.
A year.
Yeah, and you have to do that generally as a teenager.
Wow.
And so his first son did it, his second son did it, and the third son, the baby of the family, he was unable. He would try, but then,
so he'd have to tell his dad?
3 weeks or 4 weeks. Well, he was just that honest. He was that open and vulnerable. And they all knew what he was trying to do because he was trying to go in the mission field. And he would just come down the stairs all depressed, and I blew it. And
he blew it all right.
And there would be 3 weeks. Sometimes he made it as far as 6 weeks. But he never made it to the mission field. And I asked the father, I said, what about the first 2 sons? Do you think they were actually able to do it?
Yeah.
And he said, no, I think they learned to just be really good liars. And I think that's the thing, when acceptance into the community is more important than being honest to us, then yes, we become very hypocritical and very apt to lie. And the challenge there is it makes managing your love life intelligently even harder, because you're lying not only to your church, but you're lying to some degree to yourself. Yeah. But also to all the people in the church. Yeah. Including the women in the future you might be dating.
And they're accepting that that seems completely detrimental to me.
Well, and I think it's rather obvious, that that's what's going on. Any thinking person would realize that sort of wholesale lying is, or as they said in the play, mendacity. That sort of wholesale lying is really what's being taught, but it's being taught in the church, and then those who lie well become lauded for their devotion, whereas the boy who never went on his mission, he's looked at as something of a failure. Yeah, when actually he is and was the morally superior person. Yeah. Because he took seriously all the admonitions about no lying. Yeah. Fool. Fool that he was.
I like the idea of that, though, of like a father having 3 boys. It's like almost like a new biblical story in a sense. This could be part of the religion we're creating. But I like the boys. It's like 6 months in or 3 months in, 6 months in. They're like, oh man, I got this, you got it, and they're like psyching each other up. And then when they get the year, there's like a big celebration, and it's like
it would make a really
passage.
It would make a great. It would make a great story for a new religion. So you got me thinking about this new religion thing. I'd like to see a religion that really helps people rather than seeks to control people.
Yeah, and it's not dogmatic either.
Yeah, well, it couldn't be.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how could it be unless it was dogmatic about, remain open-minded, seek truth, be open to being wrong. Those kind of dogmas.
Yeah.
That would be really helpful.
I was gonna say too. It seems like then you're really into people being human. I mean, you call yourself a humanist.
Yeah. Well, I just think being a human. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I was just gonna say being human is the standard. There is no God, so pleasing some invisible creature who lives in the sky, who doesn't actually exist, pleasing him or the volcano god or any of the other gods, like Zeus or Thor or anybody else, is absurd. We don't, even if they did exist, we have no idea what it is they want. And even with Christians who say, I know what they want, I know what God wants, I've got a Bible right here. Well, then why are there thousands of different denominations? So yeah, we don't know what these mythological beings want, but humans can tell us, and we can reason together. And we can see outcomes in real time. We don't have to wait till after we die to see if there's a heaven. We can see in real time, are we raising noble-minded, loving, kind people or not? And so there's the proof right there in our practice of what it is we're doing.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think having humanity as the standard, if your belief is in service to humanity, and I don't mean in terms of dogma, but in terms of actual practice, that would be the religion for me.
Mm-hmm. So to wrap up, I think that the line that kind of always sticks out to me is that which is repressed will be expressed inappropriately.
Yeah, and I appreciate you remembering that, because that's a poster in my office, and there's a picture of a woman sweeping something under the rug, and we can't see quite what it is, but we can tell it's a monster because there's some claws. And then the man has got his back to the closet, and he's trying to keep that other monster in the closet. And they're both repressing something that they really think is awful about themselves, instead of looking at one another and saying, do you really want to know me? Do you really want to know who I am? Because if you do, I'll tell you, but it's taking a lot of risk because you may not like me.
Yeah.
And I think there's a way to do that would be more likely to be successful than not, which is not under the scope of this podcast, but there is a way to do that, and it's not akin to jumping off a cliff. I think if we're trying to make those disclosures and it feels like we're jumping off a cliff, then we're doing it wrong.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I think that about wraps it up for that conversation. So thank you for that.
Yeah. How many more days do you have?
Tomorrow is my last day.
All right.
42 days. But I have really quick on that. I think it did definitely do something positive for me.
Yeah, you said that.
I think it definitely...
Just keep repeating that. I'm sure it's true.
Have you ever done that?
I don't even know where the 42 days idea came from, but I'm sure growing up with religion all around me, I'm sure I went through efforts to repress
but have you
my
done
sexuality.
Intentionally and be
No.
All right. Well, I guess you're one of the lucky
Only
ones.
crazy people do.
Okay. It's my kind of intentional debriefing of that.
No, I'm not making a joke, because I do think it's a great thing to try.
That's funny. Great. So to wrap up, we have a listener question. And if you have a question for Steve, visit stevening.com and fill out the contact form. This week's question is short and sweet. Hi, Steve. What is the difference between having a high sex drive and sex addiction? My wife uses them interchangeably, and I would like to have an accurate response.
Yeah, the old joke is, and if you've listened to these podcasts, you maybe heard me say it, that a sex addict is defined as anyone who wants sex more than you do. So, and that's really the only definition we can go with, because sex addiction is not a thing recognized by science, not for lack of research, not for lack of looking at it, but it's really not a thing. Addiction has a substance issue like alcohol addiction, heroin addiction. And so the body, once addicted, no longer is able to function normally without getting a fix. Whereas I would say that somebody who's hypersexual and engaged in sexual behavior that is harmful to them, or that adversely affects their life in terms of their health or their job or their freedom in terms of the criminal justice system, I would say that's more of a compulsion, and it's akin much more to compulsive shopping, compulsive gambling, compulsive fill in the blank with whatever you like, because we all seem to have some level of compulsion. For me, as a younger man and even as a boy and a teenager, it was compulsively being in control and always seeking to control over myself and over people around me. And that was a compulsion, and that was really, I think, pathological, and it was just, destructive in my life. And there are many other forms of compulsive behaviors that are very soothing. So compulsive behaviors have as their goal the diminution of anxiety. So I'm feeling uncomfortable, things are feeling out of control. I need to go gamble, or I need to go, do this other thing, maybe shopping, or maybe just eating. I'm going to eat a dozen bags of cookies, not just a dozen cookies.
Yeah.
So for the rest of us, I think it's really hard for the lay person to say their spouse is a sex addict, because first of all, that's a put down that isn't even grounded in science, and the lay person has no business saying you're psychotic, or you have OCD, or you're a narcissist. Those are all just terrible things we say because we're mad and we're frustrated. We don't know what to do. But going to a real therapist, as opposed to the industry that supposedly treats sex addiction, only they never bill for sex addiction, they always bill for something else. I think if you're, going to a legitimate therapist, they'll usually point you back to your childhood, take a look at what was going on there in terms of trauma and the response to trauma for a child who wasn't able to have wonderful, loving, attentive parents, and who didn't get the help, including counseling, he might have needed. Sex is one of the many things people can turn to. And when it becomes compulsive, I think then it can be very destructive.
Yeah.
But the problem, it's a little bit, again, like that movie, As Good as It Gets, with Jack Nicholson and Helen Hunt. Jack Nicholson's character has a lot of anxiety. He has OCD, and he feels contaminated when he goes out in public, and he always has to wash his hands. He does so ritually, using a fresh bar of soap and then throwing it away between each time he does wash his hands in scalding hot water. And only if he's done the exact ritual does he feel like he's dodged a bullet. But that doesn't, we would never say, oh, he has a soap addiction.
Yeah.
And in the same way, saying someone has a sex addiction isn't helpful. It's not precise, because it labels the sexual behavior as the problem. And that's not the problem. That is a symptom of the problem.
Great.
So there you go, family.
Great. Well, thank you for the question, and thank you all for listening. And thank you, Steve. As always, it's great chatting with you. We'll see you all in the next podcast.
You are welcome. I look forward to it.